Pan-African greetings. Welcome to the Ubuntu Pulse, a podcast series by Africans Rising that shares stories of resistance, resilience, and hope across the African continent. I'm your host, Ancel Langwa, and this show is dedicated to telling the stories of individuals, of communities, and movements that are shaping Africa's social and political landscape. Here, we share hard-earned lessons, amplifying powerful voices and celebrating the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because we are. For today's episode, which is our first episode, we are honored to be joined by someone whose voice and leadership has resonated across the globe, Kumi Naidoo. Kumi Naidoo is a South African human rights and environmental justice activist who is currently the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. He is the former Secretary General of Amnesty International and also the first person from the Global South to lead Greenpeace International. He is an advisor for the Community Arts Network, and he serves as the Global Ambassador for Africa's Rising for Unity, Justice, Peace, and Dignity. His family has started the Ricky Rick Foundation for the promotion of Activism to build on the positive legacies left by popular South African rapper Ricky Rick through his music and life's work. Through this foundation, he co-founded the Global Energizing Activism Initiative. Kumi is also the author of award-winning Letters to My Mother, The Markings of a Troublemaker, and also the host of a powerful podcast, Power, People, and Planet. Please, dear comrades, help me welcome Kumi Naidoo to today's podcast. Kumi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ansel, and I'm so happy to be with you in a podcast that I think should have been launched a long time ago by Africans Rising, but better late than never, and I'm so excited that this podcast is happening. I hope that it's going to support Africans Rising in its efforts to reach much larger numbers of people in the African continent and in the African diaspora.
Definitely. That is our wish too. And we hope that we get to reach more and more people by having such wonderful conversations with people like you. So we're just going to delve straight in, and we're going to start from the beginning. You dedicated your life to fighting for justice, from the townships of South Africa to global platforms. Was there a specific moment that sparked your journey into activism? Anything that comes to mind?
So when I was 15, my mother sadly committed suicide at the age of 38. It was also a year after I had become politically awakened by the injustices around me. And then 2 weeks after she passed, there was a national student uprising. And I was one of the people that emerged as leaders of that effort at the age of 15. The slogan at the front of the march was, "We want equality," meaning equality in education. By the time the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a color TV," because they thought that was the slogan at the front of the march. And if I'm brutally honest, at that time I wanted a color TV and equality almost equally, and both appeared equally impossible to get. But I tell you the story is that to young people especially, it doesn't mean you have to understand everything. Why should we understand the solutions to the world when the political leaders and the business leaders who have all the power cannot come up with the solutions to create a fair world? So it doesn't matter whether you know everything. What you know can be sufficient for you to be able to get involved. So that was the defining moment for me, the national student uprisings in 1980. Mainly peaceful protests were met with violence and tear gas and detentions without trial and so on. So that experience taught me that silence in the face of injustice is a complicity. And from then on, activism wasn't optional, it was a moral duty.
I love that. Activism wasn't optional, it was a moral duty. So let's just looking back at those early days filled with both struggle and courage. What's one lesson from your youth that still guides your work today?
There are many, but the lesson I carry most strongly from early activism is that courage is not the absence of fear. I was scared often of arrest, of letting my family down, or as often happened, we would be in hiding and then they would raid our homes and our family, especially my younger sister and my dad, would have to bear the brunt of it and so on. But I learned that fear loses power when we stand together. Another lesson is that we must always marry courage with humility. In South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, it was the collective, not the individual hero, that carried us forward. That truth still guides me in every global struggle that I've been part of, which simply is this: it is people who make history, it's not individual leaders that make history, however good they might be.
Okay, very interesting. And I think it just talks more on the power of collective. There's my favorite African proverb that says a single bracelet does not jingle. So I love that African proverb because it just talks so much about the power of collective action. And you just mentioned that. But let's now go to Africans rising.
Ancel, if I can just introduce another African proverb that I think is also important for collective.
Okay, sure.
For collective leadership. Sure. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Go together.
Right?
Yes.
And so,
definitely.
So on the African continent, we have too much. And I wouldn't say it's not peculiar to the African continent, to many countries around the world. We have placed too much of faith in political leaders and are not able to deliver because of the structural limitations of power. And we have given our power to them, and now is the time for us to claim back our power and recognize that if we are not active citizens, if we think that democracy is simply casting a vote every 4 or 5 years and then we go to sleep for 5 years, then we are not fulfilling our responsibilities as citizens. Our governments must be kept on their feet in between election periods, and that is why the work of Africans Rising to create an informed, passionate, active African citizenry that unites across the boundaries that have been left to us by colonialism, that doesn't make economic sense, cultural sense, linguistic sense, environmental sense, or any other sense. It is important that we say that collective leadership is critically important, and real democracy is much more than casting a ballot once every 4 or 5 years. It's about participating actively in all the struggles that our societies face and our communities face.
Yeah, definitely. And you just spoke about what the responsibility of Africans Rising is. And that just brings me to my next question. I want us to talk about Africans Rising because we have an understanding that Africans Rising is more than just an organization. It's a movement. It's also a call to action. So what inspired its creation? You're global ambassador for Africans Rising. What inspired the creation of Africans Rising? And what do you think makes Africans Rising or made Africans Rising different from other networks or groups that you had been a part of?
I think first and foremost to me, Africans Rising means we are no longer defined by the borders carved by colonial powers at a conference in Berlin a long time ago. It means rising above centuries of exploitation into a future defined by unity, creativity, and resilience. Rising means refusing to be boxed in by narratives of poverty or crisis, and instead asserting that Africa is a continent of abundance, of culture, ideas, spirit, and possibility. When Africans rise, we rise for ourselves, but we also rise for humanity, because Africa's liberation is bound up with global liberation. It is very important that Africans must remind ourselves that Africa is the richest continent underneath the ground. You name it, we have it, right? And that's precisely why we're one of the poorest continents above the ground, what the academics call the resource curse. So it's high time our leaders get their act together, stop sending our raw materials overseas to get processed there, and then we have to buy it back at a very high premium price, right? We need to be able to develop the capacity to whatever resources that we have, provided we can extract it without hurting the environment. And let's be very clear that climate change is driven by the addiction of societies, which was given to us by the so-called civilized part of the world, the global north, who told us that the only energy system you can have is based on oil, coal, and gas. And that has meant we have violated the rights of indigenous peoples. We have, destroyed our forests and so on. But thankfully, we have still got lots that we can still protect. And so we have to be saying that our continent is not what Tony Blair said a couple of years ago, the Prime Minister of Britain, when he said Africa is the scar on the conscience of humanity. Actually, if you're going to talk in those terms, Europe and North America are a scar on the conscience of humanity. We did not give the world slavery. We did not give the world colonialism. We did not give the world fossil fuel dependence. We did not give the world, nuclear weapons, the military-industrial complex, and so on. So we must be very clear that if we assert our identity and our beliefs as the African people across the continent, united as we are under Africans Rising, we can contribute the solutions that humanity needs, together with the other 88% of the world's population that lives in the global south. So that statistic I just want to repeat. 88% of the world's people lives in the global south. And even if you look at our international NGOs, in the form of Greenpeace and Amnesty, two organizations I worked with, you would see that actually they don't even come anywhere close to reflecting that diversity in their staff, leadership, and so on. And we have to say today, as Africans Rising, and that's why we don't say we see ourselves as a movement, we're not an NGO, we're not building a big bureaucracy just for the sake of it. And we say to the world, you have to be as good as your words are. We are done with your telling us how to behave, but you all then behave in a different way, right? You'll say torture is bad, but you all can torture, right? So the double standards, the time has come for double standards to end. And for me, Africans Rising is also about ending these double standards and creating the strongest possible unity of the people on the African continent together with our brothers and sisters in the diaspora.
Thank you so much, Kumi, for again giving more meaning to what, people are excited to be a part of Africans Rising, but of course they do not understand exactly what it means for Africans to rise. And I'm happy that you have. Yes, please. So maybe I'll give some history of how it happened. Would that be helpful? Sure.
This dream of Pan-African unity has been with many of us for a long time, right? We could see that there's no way individual countries on the African continent, however strong they might think they are, whether it be South Africa, Nigeria, or Egypt, or Ethiopia, some of the bigger ones on the continent, they must have no illusions that alone they are far too weak to deal with the global system that is stacked against us, right? And so this vision was not a new vision that I had as the founding chair and launch director of Africans Rising. It was a vision that was there. And I myself was inspired by an amazing Pan-Africanist, Tajuddin Abdul Rahim from Nigeria, who I met. I always say when I fled South Africa into exile, I fled as a South African. Then I met Taju and a range of people across the continent. And Taju, the first time he saw me, said, "Comrade, you have arrived at Oxford as a South African. By the time you go back home, you will be an continental African. You will be speaking and you must be acting not just in the interests of South Africa, because to act in the interests of South Africa means to act in the interests of all of Africa's people." So then after my 6 years at Greenpeace, literally the last day of the Paris climate negotiations in 2015, some of the colleagues from Africa and around the world who had this interest in supporting this vision asked me if I would be the launch director. And they had a very limited vision. It was more like an African civil society center. And I said, I'm not interested in a center and a think tank in itself. But if you're talking about building a movement, and then I volunteered. I did this as a volunteer for 2.5 years of helping build Africans Rising, because it was something that I felt I owed to the Amilcar Cabrals of the world, to the Julius Nyereres of the world, to the Nelson Mandelas of the world, to Thomas Sankara and all the people that inspired us, some of whom were killed by the very colonial powers that they helped liberate the societies from. And so we started by looking at all the things that didn't work before when we tried to organize networks on the African continent. And we said we must learn from that. And one of the things we didn't want to do was develop dependency on Global North funding. So while we knew that we had to start there, there's a very clear direction of travel and vision for Africans Rising to ultimately be able to fund ourselves solely from African resources. And I'm glad to see that vision is still alive and we're working towards it, even if we are not there yet. So then we had a validation conference in Arusha, Tanzania, in 2016 to validate the idea of all the consultations we had done online and so on over a 9-month period. And people at that event, young people from North Africa, old people from Southern Africa, a wonderful diversity of every nation across the African continent was there. And people said, let's create something that genuinely will ensure that when any African country is under threat, the first voices of solidarity must come from Africans themselves. So even though the official launch of Africans Rising was on 25th of May, African Liberation Day 2017, right?
Yeah.
In December, there was the elections in Gambia of 2016, where Yahya Jammeh lost the election, first accepted it, and then said he was not going to accept it. And what we said was, when we have a situation like that, it should be Africans that are there first on the ground. So the Africans Rising sent a delegation of 4 people, a woman from Senegal, a woman from Nigeria, and 2 of us from South Africa. And it was quite strange. We were flying into Banjul, where everybody else was fleeing out because the fear of violence and so on. And we were there to say we don't want African blood to be spilt. We've spilt enough blood on our continent. And so then in May 2017, the launch happened. And then I was pleased that while I was in Gambia, I was inspired by Mohamed Lamin Sadiqen, who led the resistance to Yahya Jammeh. The campaign was called Gambia Has Decided, meaning they have voted, no more messing around. Yeah. And then Kumba Toure, who I've known for many decades, a brilliant African woman writer and activist. And they both came together and they led Africans Rising for the first period. And I'm very grateful to them and so many other people that contributed over the years. And, I'll tell you one funny thing. When I was leaving to go to Amnesty, some of the older activists said to me, hey, Kumi, do you think you're leaving too early? Maybe you should stay for another year. No. And then I said, our vision was, this is a resource for the younger generation, right? We knew that our time had passed. We had done our thing. We did not succeed as much as we wanted. Let's give the space to younger people. And, what's the worst that could happen? They'll fail like we did, because we also failed to deliver the goals that we are thinking. And when I was at the All Africa Movement Assembly in Accra, Ghana, in August of last year, I have to confess, I was sitting in the back quietly. I felt like an old man who was looking at the old man looking at his children, saying, my God,
Ryan, yeah.
They are so much better than me. And I say this not just to be modest, but I am totally convinced that the younger leadership that we have done a much better job than say, if I stayed on in those roles for another year or so. Yeah, I'm sorry I'd give such a long answer, but I think it's
No, I think
that people know the background and the history.
Yes. No, I think it's very important. And I was happy that you said it because it's very important that people know. And I think what you did is that's one of the things that we tell people, we tell young people when we're talking about movement building. And we use the kind of, the story that you have shared, some important parts of it, like building something, then leaving it on for others to continue on what you started. And I think that, and we're just talking about different, we're talking about power and leadership in a youth conference that I had sometime. And, you have young people who say they don't trust others to do the work that they think they will do. So they create and remain there because, they think they are the best person to do the work. But we're like, no, sometimes letting go would allow people you see the potential that others have. So thank you so much for that story. I think it's a good lesson for our young people. But now just leave away from Africans Rising and talk about the times that we are in, overlapping crises from the climate change, inequality, conflict, democratic backsliding. You can name them. What does Pan-African solidarity look like in this moment? What do you think Pan-African solidarity looks like? And how do you think movements across the continent and in the diaspora can build stronger connections to drive collective action? I know you already mentioned about the power of the collective. So how do you think they can do this?
Firstly, I would say Pan-African solidarity isn't just a slogan. It's a survival strategy. When cyclones hit Mozambique or Malawi, it's not just their problem, it's ours. When young people rise against police brutality in Nigeria, their struggle is our struggle. Solidarity means sharing resources, amplifying each other's voices, and building bridges across the continent and the diaspora. The diaspora in particular is crucial. They carry networks, knowledge, and influence that can pressure global powers. Solidarity, therefore, is weaving our struggles into a single fabric strong enough to withstand the storm of climate collapse, inequality, and the rise of authoritarianism that we are seeing in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. So, right now, Pan-Africanism, some people say, oh, that's an unrealistic idea. Oh, that's a luxurious idea. No. Pan-Africanism today, if is not realized, doesn't give the majority of people in Africa the chance for a better future. Any leader on the continent thinking they can act unilaterally and think of their own country and do deals with a couple of rich countries and that's going to keep them good and happy and strong are deluding themselves. We must not allow ourselves to be divided and ruled as we were during slavery, colonialism, and afterwards. Our best possibilities is us getting a new generation of young leaders. And let's be clear, our continent is a young continent. It has young people are in the majority. But when you look at our leaders, you would think that, most of our leaders, with a few exceptions, they look like that they're all members of a geriatric society, which I could be a member of, right? And so why do our leaders, some of them who got involved very young, by the way, in activism and then in political leadership, if they were good enough to do it when they're young, why is it that they think that the young generation today, which has so much of innovation, creativity, and passion and so on, will not be able to do things? So basically, though, what I would like to say is that people talk about this moment as a moment of crisis and, I've called it a convergence of crisis, a boiling point. Somebody called it a perfect storm and so on. But let's be very clear. In this moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, our courage, and our sense of humanity. Now, there are many people listening to this podcast who will wake up like me certain mornings, listen to the news, and feel, things are really bad. We're seeing democracy backsliding. We're seeing violence on the rise. We're seeing a genocide in Gaza. We're seeing climate denialism by the U.S. administration. So many bad things. And I don't want to sugarcoat the moment that we're in. The moment that we are in was not a moment that any of us 10 years ago thought we would be, right? But let me put a positive spin on it. So that's on the bad side. But let me tell you on the positive side, having been around now for about 45 years of struggle for justice, I don't remember on the positive side, Ancel, any moment in more than 4.5 decades of struggle where the appetite for deep structural and systemic change is as high as it is now, right? I'm not saying that the majority are with us yet, but for sure, it's never been as large as it is now. So people recognize that we would be like what Albert Einstein once said when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. We want to declare we don't want to fit that definition of insanity. We've tried many things in the past. Some have worked, some have not. So what is our challenge today moving forward? We look at our history of struggle. We say, okay, this strategy's worked, so we bank that and we continue to use that. This strategy has not worked, so let's say, and one of the strategies that has not worked is we spend too much of time trying to appeal to our business leaders and our political leaders. What we need to do is, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk to them, but when we talk to them, we must make sure we've talked to our people first. Speak to the powerless, make sure the powerless are behind you before you speak to the powerful. Because the powerful will only take you seriously when they know that when you are sitting in the meeting with them, that the powerless got your back, right? If they think they don't have your back, why should they listen to us, right? However justifiable, intellectually sound our arguments might be, if we cannot show that we got constituency behind us, then just be very clear, governments will ignore what we are saying. So for all of those reasons, we have to recognize that, yes, this moment we are in is challenging, but this moment also calls on us to be the best we can be, the most creative we can be, the most innovation we can bring, and so on. And I believe it is well within the capability of the peoples of Africa across the continent to do that which history calls upon us to do right now. However, our current brand of leadership, political leadership and business leadership, with exceptions, leave much to be desired. So I say to young people, you need to now start imagining that you are running your governments. But please don't make the mistake that our governments have made. Because most of our leaders in government across the world and the African continent especially suffer from a terrible disease, actually. It's a worse disease affecting humanity. And it's a disease, not HIV/AIDS, not cancer, not influenza. It's a disease you can call affluenza. Affluenza is a pathological illness where far too many people have come to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more material acquisitions. So I say, we should probably start coming up with bold ideas, saying that the payment that members of parliament and cabinet ministers get should not be more than the median wage of that society. Because if our political leaders cannot live the pain of our people, do not know what our people are going through, why should we expect them to act in our interests with genuine commitment? They will act in the interests of the 1%, the upper class that they are part of, right? Why should our leaders be driving luxury cars when our people don't have food to eat, right? Why should our leaders live in suburbs where the 95% of the people can't have that lifestyle, right? So we need to say to our leaders, loud and clear, you all are servants of the people. And if you cannot behave like servants of the people, get the hell out of the way and let people who have a servant mentality step into leadership. And I hope young people will push back on the idea that young people are the leaders of tomorrow. If young people wait for tomorrow to take leadership, they're not going to be a tomorrow to take leadership.
Exactly.
People must take leadership now. And I tell you, the most important thing that young people can bring to leadership is the freshness of the lenses of the eyes. What I mean by that is they can look at old intractable problems with a fresh perspective and help humanity find new solutions to old problems, because my generation, I'm sad to say, have run out of fresh ideas, and we are not able to provide the kind of visionary thinking because we don't have the ability to imagine a life and a society different from the injustice that we've lived in for so long. To young people, I say to you, dream. Imagine a more just, more equal, more sustainable Africa and work for it. And don't let anybody intimidate you with either saying, oh, that you are unrealistic, or saying to you, your time will come. When you are mature and you are old, you can take leadership then. Right now, just shut up and keep your mouth closed. Don't accept that. If you accept that, you are betraying the vision that we can achieve for Africa, which is just, fair, equitable, and sustainable as well. And I strongly feel if we get it right, Africa can be on the pathway to being one of the most prosperous continents in the entire world if we unite, if we go with the words of Africans Rising, which is unity, justice, peace, and dignity. Those 4 words, if we can realize, we put our people on a different level for the future.
Thank you so much, Kumi, for that. And I think that you have given a very important message to our young people. Is there anything you can say to these other people who are looking to start, who want to be part of the change that we want to see in the continent?
So the first thing I would say is, don't be afraid of starting. And don't see activism as simply, oh my God, it's such a burden, it's such a hard job. No, I say to young people, activism can be what you make it to be. It can be loving, it can be fun, it can be sexy, it can be musical, it can be artistic, right? And you know, for me, what gives me hope is how ordinary Africans with very little are able to do extraordinary things, right? You know, whether it's the women of Liberia who forced peace talks to happen when they withheld sex to their husbands, whether it's a youth leading climate strikes from Kampala to Cape Town, whether it's innovators creating solar projects in rural villages, artists who use music and poetry to awaken consciousness. These stories remind me that Africa's future is not being written in boardrooms in New York or Brussels. It's being written every day by young people in Nairobi, Lagos, Accra, and Lilongwe. That's what inspires me. And I say to young people or older people, if you are thinking about activism, choose something that gives you joy. If you're an arts teacher, say it, right? If you're an arts teacher, don't go join a committee where they are drafting, you know, constitution of how you're going to function, where you are bored by those things. Rather put up your hand and say, you know what? I can work with kids in the community and I can do murals in these buildings where the walls are dirty and so on. I can beautify the community and we could put messages there that help people talk about their, you know, their pride in society, and put the messages of unity, justice, dignity, and so on, right? And so the last thing I would say, staying with young people for a second, you know, the other thing that young Africans should know is that you are not alone. Change doesn't come from perfect people with all the answers. It comes from people who dare to begin. Start where you are, with what you have, and with who you have. Find community, learn, stumble, fall, but wake up quickly and grow. Don't let the size of the challenge paralyze you. Remember the African proverb, which we said earlier, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And above all, never underestimate your voice. Even when it feels small, it can ripple in ways you may never imagine.